It is not in a man's silence that you see his strength. It is in how he uses that silence. There is a stillness that heals. And then there is silence that harms. Many people confuse the two. When a man ignores you, you may feel that he holds the power. But pause and observe more deeply. What kind of power requires withdrawal, neglect, and emotional distance? Not the power of mastery, not the power of a centered spirit. In truth, a man who consistently ignores you is not showcasing strength. He is revealing where he is still untrained. In his presence, you may feel invisible. But often, this reveals how invisible he has become to himself. This is the paradox of emotional avoidance. The more he tries to protect his ego by withdrawing, the more he damages the very thing that could have made him strong, his capacity to connect, to feel, to stand in presence. In this moment, ask not, why is he ignoring me? Ask instead, what part of himself is he unable to face? That answer will bring you clarity. And from clarity, you will choose not from emotion, but from alignment. There is a quiet illusion that silence carries strength, that when a man ignores you, he is asserting some higher ground, some unspoken wisdom or stoic discipline. But what if that silence isn't strength at all? What if it is, in fact, avoidance disguised as control? Many people experience this dynamic and internalize the rejection. They ask themselves, what did I do wrong? They replay conversations, scroll through memories, search for a missed cue or a wrong word. Yet, beneath this external searching is an internal misunderstanding, assuming that being ignored is about them, rather than what it actually reveals about the other person's emotional state. When a man ignores someone who genuinely cares, he may appear emotionally detached on the surface, but often he is simply unskilled in handling emotional presence. Neuroscience points to a pattern when emotional demands exceed a person's capacity to process and respond. The brain's threat response activates. This is the same response triggered in danger: fight, flight, or freeze. For many men, ignoring is the emotional equivalent of freezing, not because they are powerful, but because they feel overwhelmed. The silence is not composure, it is retreat. There is a significant distinction between solitude and avoidance. Solitude is chosen, it's restorative, clear, and intentional. Avoidance, on the other hand, is reactive. It pushes away rather than faces. In relationships, this difference matters. A man who avoids emotional engagement under the mask of ignoring someone isn't in control of his emotions. He's at the mercy of them. This becomes more visible when viewed through lived experiences. A woman once shared her story of loving a man who grew silent every time conflict or vulnerability arose. When she would speak about her needs, his past, or their future, he would withdraw. Days would pass with no contact. At first, she believed he needed space, but over time, the silence became a pattern, a tactic that subtly taught her to suppress her own needs. She walked on eggshells just to avoid another stretch of being emotionally abandoned. Here, the emotional cost becomes evident. Being ignored doesn't just hurt because of the silence. It hurts because of what the silence implies. You are not worth responding to. Yet, the truth is rarely that simple. Often, a man who chooses to ignore is not making a conscious choice to devalue you. Instead, he is choosing to avoid facing himself. To be present in a relationship requires one to be present with their own emotions. And for some, that level of self-confrontation is simply too much. What appears as disinterest may actually be dysregulation. In psychological terms, dysregulation refers to the inability to manage emotional responses or to keep them within a functional range. For some men, especially those raised with beliefs equating vulnerability with weakness, sitting with emotions, whether their own or someone else's, can feel unsafe, and so silence becomes the shield. Ignoring becomes the weapon they use not against others, but against their own emotional discomfort. We must remember, not all who are silent are wise, and not all who walk away are strong. Eastern philosophy reminds us that strength lies not in withdrawal, but in stillness, not in silence, but in mindful presence. To face another person's truth without defense is to reveal one's own inner stability. A man who cannot stay present with a conversation, with emotions, or with conflict is not grounded. He is drifting. He is not hiding from you. He is hiding from himself. And the greatest cost of this avoidance is not only the relationships he damages, it's the self-awareness he never develops. Now consider the second layer of this pattern. What is not expressed consciously finds another path. Suppressed emotions do not dissolve. They leak. They show up in tone, in posture, in energy. You can feel them in a room even when no words are spoken. The tension, the shift in breathing, the way someone looks away at just the wrong time. Psychology confirms this through what's called emotional leakage. The non-verbal expression of emotions a person is trying to hide. A man might claim everything is fine, but his eyes drift, his voice sharpens, or he stops initiating contact. You sense the disconnection not because he says it, but because your nervous system picks it up. Human beings are wired for connection. We feel what is not said more deeply than what is. This is why a man who ignores isn't truly silent. His avoidance speaks louder than his presence ever did. And so, the ignored person begins to doubt herself. She questions her value. But these questions are misdirected. The real question is, what part of him is he unwilling to reveal? Often, a man who ignores isn't emotionally detached. He is emotionally flooded. He's suppressing fear, uncertainty, inadequacy. But because he lacks the tools to articulate these, he instead vanishes. His withdrawal becomes his survival. His silence becomes his escape hatch from emotional exposure. There is a story of a carpenter who built a beautiful house for his family. Every nail driven, every beam lifted was done with care. But the moment the storms came, he refused to reinforce it. He'd retreat indoors, telling himself the storm would pass. He didn't want to look at the leaks or the cracks forming in the foundation. He ignored the signs until the house began to fall apart. Not because he didn't love it, but because facing its fragility reminded him of his own. This is how some men approach relationships. They build connection in the beginning when emotions are light and controllable. But when emotional weather arrives, conflict, depth, vulnerability, they step back not because they do not care, but because they never learned how to reinforce the foundation. They were taught to build, but not to maintain, to chase, but not to stay. It is crucial not to misinterpret this as malice. In most cases, it isn't. But that does not mean it's harmless. Emotional avoidance leaves a scar. To be ignored by someone you love sends signals to your nervous system that say, you're unsafe, you're unseen, you're unworthy of response. These are deeply damaging beliefs when internalized, and so wisdom is needed. You must learn to see the silence not as truth, but as a reflection of someone's inner turmoil. You must understand that being ignored says less about your worth and more about their capacity. And you must anchor yourself in emotional clarity rather than confusion. This is where self-mastery begins, not in controlling others, but in perceiving them accurately. Not in demanding responses, but in reading silence through the lens of insight rather than insecurity. There is an ancient saying, the tongue may lie, but the energy never does. Ignoring someone requires energy. It is not neutral. It is not passive. It is an active choice to disconnect, and behind every disconnection is either pain or fear. When a man uses silence, you must ask, what is he trying not to feel? Because in that answer lies the truth of who he is. Emotional presence is not about words. It is about capacity, the ability to hold space, to stay, to witness someone's vulnerability without judgment. That is strength. Ignoring is not that. Ignoring is the collapse of presence. It is the default of an untrained mind. And while it may appear calm, it is internally chaotic. True connection cannot grow where avoidance lives. And so, the one who is ignored must make a choice, not to chase the silence, but to return to their own center, to recognize that their value is not diminished by someone else's inability to meet them, to understand that presence is not something you beg for. It is something you attract through your own inner stability. And that begins when you stop trying to decode silence and start listening to yourself. Ask, does this silence nourish or harm me? Ask, is this space allowing growth or is it shrinking my spirit? Ask, am I holding onto a version of someone that no longer exists? These questions guide you back to truth, not the surface level truth of someone's actions, but the deeper truth of your emotional needs, your boundaries, and your self-worth. There is no shame in desiring emotional presence. It is a healthy need, but when it is denied consistently, when it is manipulated through silence, one must walk toward clarity, because staying in spaces where your voice is unheard slowly teaches you to mute yourself, and that is too high a price to pay for love. Silence, when used as meditation, heals, but silence, when used as avoidance, breaks. The greatest weakness of a man who ignores is not that he distances himself from others. It is that he distances himself from the one place he most needs to be, the present moment, with you, with himself, with reality. That distance becomes his limitation. And your understanding of that distance becomes your liberation. In the quiet moments of disconnection, when one person pulls away emotionally, something subtle but profound takes place. Not only between two people, but within the soul of the one who withdraws. Emotional disconnection, though often dismissed as a form of self-protection or independence, carries a hidden cost that cannot be seen immediately. Over time, it erodes the core strength of the very person who believes they are preserving themselves through detachment. It is not merely about ignoring someone else. It is about weakening the bond between one's inner self and outer actions, between thought and feeling, between presence and truth. When a man emotionally disconnects, particularly from someone who genuinely cares for him, he often believes he's stepping into a safer space, free from conflict, free from expectations, free from vulnerability. But emotional safety that is built on withdrawal is not safety at all. It is isolation. And isolation, when chosen out of fear rather than clarity, never nurtures strength. It corrodes it. Eastern wisdom teaches that to be disconnected from others is to first be disconnected from oneself. This teaching is not metaphorical. It is a lived truth that manifests in how a person shows up in relationships. A man cannot offer presence if he has no presence within himself. He cannot hold space for another person's emotions if he fears or avoids his own. So when emotional disconnection occurs, it signals a fracture, not just in the relationship, but in the man's own inner alignment. It's tempting to look at someone who withdraws and assume that they are strong, that their distance is a sign of discipline, of boundaries, of mastery over their emotions. But silence does not always signify mastery. Sometimes it reflects a lack of training. Stillness and shutdown may look similar, but they arise from very different places. Stillness is rooted in awareness. Shutdown is rooted in fear. A man who emotionally disconnects, not because he has processed the situation, but because he wants to escape, it is not choosing peace. He is choosing numbness. The long-term impact of this disconnection can be seen in patterns. When a man withdraws again and again in times of emotional intensity, He begins to train his nervous system not for resilience, but for retreat. What he practices becomes his instinct. So instead of growing the ability to stay present in discomfort, he reinforces the habit of leaving it. Over time, this weakens his relational capacity, because every moment of withdrawal is a moment not spent learning how to stay. Every silence is a missed opportunity to strengthen emotional resilience. A woman shared how she noticed this shift in her partner. Early in their relationship, he was attentive and emotionally open, but as the connection deepened and vulnerability increased, he began to retreat. At first, it was subtle, taking longer to respond to texts, avoiding deeper conversations. But gradually, the space grew wider. She thought maybe he needed time to adjust to intimacy. But intimacy requires participation, not distance. And what he was doing wasn't adjusting, it was abandoning. Not in a dramatic, intentional way, but in the slow erosion of presence. She stayed for a long time, thinking he would return to the man she first knew. But the truth was, that man had never learned to stay. He only knew how to approach emotionally safe ground. Once the deeper waters came, he did what he always had: disappear. The man didn't lose her because he didn't care. He lost her because he couldn't stay with himself long enough to stay with her. His disconnection was not rejection. It was self-avoidance. He couldn't sit in the emotional discomfort of her pain, or his own responsibility, or the mirror of who he was becoming. And that inability became his weakness. This kind of disconnection reveals something deeper. A man cannot hold the heart of another if he cannot hold the weight of his own emotions. Emotional disconnection is not simply the absence of talking or touching. It is the absence of internal alignment. It is the moment when a man separates his mind from his body, his thoughts from his feelings, and his actions from their impact. From a neurological standpoint, this makes sense. When the prefrontal cortex, the seat of logic and empathy, loses its grip in moments of emotional overwhelm, the brain falls back into the limbic system, the part responsible for instinctive reactions. For men untrained in emotional awareness, this often translates into withdrawal. Their mind tells them, I can't deal with this right now. But what it's really saying is, I don't know how to be with this without breaking. And so they leave, not always physically, but emotionally. And the person left behind feels that absence like a shadow, present even when nothing is said. To live from this place is to live half alive, because true aliveness comes from connection. Connection to breath, to feeling, to thought, to others. And when a man chooses disconnection, he doesn't just abandon the relationship, he abandons his own humanity. He becomes a performer in his own life, acting out what is expected, while his inner world remains unvisited, unexplored, and unhealed. There is an old teaching that says, the tree that bears fruit must first be rooted. A man who is disconnected from his own emotional roots cannot bear the fruits of presence, empathy, or relational growth. He may succeed in his career, hold a calm exterior, even be admired for his composure. But composure without connection is hollow. It is a form of self-protection that eventually collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. And yet, this disconnection is not destiny. It is a habit, and habits can be unlearned. But to unlearn disconnection, a man must first recognize it, not just as a behavioral pattern, but as a symptom of deeper fear. Fear of being seen, fear of feeling too much, fear of failing in emotional intimacy. These fears are not weaknesses in themselves. What becomes weakness is the unwillingness to face them. A man who chooses to remain emotionally distant cannot offer the depth of love that a committed relationship requires. Not because he is unloving, but because love cannot flow where fear dominates. And love is not a concept. It is an action. It is a decision to stay when it's hard, to speak when it's uncomfortable, to listen when the ego wants to defend. Disconnection is easy. Presence is a practice. This is where the journey of inner strength truly begins. It's not about learning how to hide better. It's about learning how to stay. Stay with discomfort, stay with vulnerability, stay with responsibility. That's where emotional maturity grows. There was a story of an elderly monk who mentored young men in a village. One day, a young man asked him, "How do I know if I am strong enough for love?" The monk smiled and replied, "Go sit in silence with yourself for 1 week. If you do not run from what you see, then you are ready to be seen by someone else." That story speaks volumes. Emotional strength is not measured by how much one can hide or how long one can stay silent. It is measured by how deeply one can sit with their own truth and still offer kindness, still remain present, still choose to engage with life. Emotional disconnection may offer short-term relief, but it guarantees long-term emptiness. The more a man avoids himself, the more fragmented he becomes. And fragmentation never builds lasting love. It builds confusion. For the person on the receiving end, this confusion is exhausting. They begin to question their own sense of reality. Why is he so distant? Did I do something wrong? Why doesn't he show up anymore? But these questions only loop in circles because they are aimed at the wrong target. The real question is not what you did. The real question is whether he ever developed the capacity to stay, to be present, to connect deeply without fear. Relationships reveal the emotional fitness of a person. They are like mirrors. Whatever is unhealed, unresolved, or avoided will rise to the surface. A man who consistently disconnects in relationships is not lacking love. He is lacking the muscle of presence. And presence, like any muscle, grows through repetition. Through staying when it's uncomfortable. Through listening without defending. Through choosing awareness over avoidance. The path to reclaiming emotional strength does not lie in grand gestures. It lies in the simple act of staying. Staying emotionally available in moments that feel raw, exposed, and vulnerable. It lies in not using silence as a shield, but allowing truth to be spoken, heard, and held with respect. And in that holding, something sacred happens. The man begins to find himself again, not the persona he crafted, but the essence he once abandoned. He begins to see that the courage to stay emotionally open, to stay responsible, to stay honest, is not just a gift to others, it is a gift to himself. It is the place where his fragmented parts begin to return, where his spirit begins to ground, where he remembers that true masculinity is not about controlling emotion, but being at peace with it. To disconnect is easy, but to be fully present in love, that is a discipline, that is strength. And that is what transforms not only relationships, but the man himself. There is a silence that speaks of peace, and there is a silence that shouts of chaos. In relationships, few things are as disorienting as being on the receiving end of intentional silence. When one person chooses to withhold communication, affection, or presence, not out of reflection or rest, but to control, punish, or distance. This kind of silence does not calm the soul. It unsettles it. It does not create space for healing. It creates tension, confusion, and doubt. And yet, it is often misunderstood. The one who uses silence to punish often believes they are asserting control, maintaining dignity, or avoiding unnecessary conflict. But in reality, that silence is rarely a sign of strength. More often than not, it is a symptom of inner turmoil. The mind that is still is not the same as the mind that is shut down. Stillness is aware, receptive, and balanced. It holds space. Shut down, on the other hand, is reactionary. It blocks, avoids, deflects. It may appear calm from the outside, but inside it is storming. Psychologically, The use of silence as punishment is often referred to as emotional withholding or the silent treatment. It's a form of passive aggression, and it works not by engaging in conflict, but by denying connection. It sends a subtle yet powerful message. You don't matter enough for me to respond. For the one receiving this silence, it can feel like standing in a room that was once warm, now gone cold without warning. But what drives this behavior? Research in neuroscience offers clarity. When a person feels overwhelmed, uncertain, or emotionally threatened, the brain's amygdala is activated. This is the part of the brain that manages fear, threat perception, and emotional memory. In heightened states, the brain may default to one of three primal responses: fight, flight, or freeze. The silent treatment is often a manifestation of the freeze response, an attempt to create distance from perceived emotional danger without confrontation. It's not thought through, it's instinctual. The nervous system is trying to regulate the sense of overwhelm by shutting down interaction. Yet, in relationships, this shutdown doesn't regulate, it disconnects. Imagine a couple sitting in the same room. One has said something that unintentionally hurt the other. The hurt one chooses not to respond, not with words, not with gestures. They don't speak for hours or days. There are no raised voices, no open conflict, only silence. The air is thick. Every movement feels measured. The other partner begins to feel punished, not knowing how to fix what is unspoken. This silence, though quiet in form, is loud in message. It says, I'm upset, and I want you to feel the discomfort of not knowing what to do. It's not resolution. It's revenge. The irony is that many who use this form of silence do so to protect themselves from pain. Yet in doing so, they cause pain to others and often deepen their own. The emotional pain they avoid expressing doesn't disappear. It remains inside, unprocessed, slowly building resentment, mistrust, and emotional fatigue. In time, it becomes a pattern, and this pattern becomes a barrier to real intimacy. In relationships, communication is not only about words. It is about emotional presence. When presence is intentionally withdrawn, the relational field becomes destabilized. The person who is punished by silence begins to question their own reality. Did I do something wrong? Am I being too sensitive? Why is it so hard to have a simple conversation? They begin to fill the silence with self-doubt. In many cases, this silence triggers wounds from the past, childhood memories of being neglected, invalidated, or made to feel invisible. The brain doesn't separate past from present. When it comes to emotional triggers, it simply reacts. So, one moment of being ignored today can reopen years of stored pain. And this is why silence, when used as a weapon, can be more damaging than words spoken in anger. Words may sting, but at least they give form to pain. Silence makes the pain invisible, making it harder to heal. A woman once described how her partner would stop speaking to her for days if she brought up anything that made him uncomfortable. At first, she thought he just needed time to cool off. But with time, she realized the silence wasn't about cooling off. It was about control. He was using silence to make her retreat, to make her think twice before ever expressing discomfort again. And slowly, it worked. She found herself censoring her truth, editing her needs, and tiptoeing around his moods just to avoid another wave of silence. She became a shadow in her own relationship, not because he said anything harsh, but because he said nothing at all. This is the hidden power of silence misused. It does not shout, but it suffocates. And yet, the person using silence is not always aware of the harm they're causing. They may think, I just needed space, or I didn't want to argue. They believe they are choosing peace, but in reality, they are avoiding discomfort. The avoidance doesn't resolve the issue, it just delays the explosion. Because emotions that are ignored don't vanish. They accumulate. To engage in silence as punishment is to deny both oneself and the other person an opportunity to grow. It's like walking out of a classroom. Every time a difficult subject comes up, the lesson doesn't go away. It waits, and it returns with more urgency the next time. From a spiritual and philosophical perspective, intentional silence with the aim to hurt reveals a disordered mind, a mind that has not yet learned to integrate feeling and thought, a mind that equates avoidance with strength. But true strength is the ability to stay present in discomfort, to remain rooted while storms pass, to speak gently even when anger tries to rise. Silence has its sacred place, but when used as a barrier instead of a bridge, it becomes a sign of emotional immaturity. It is important to recognize the distinction between healthy space and harmful silence. Healthy space is intentional, clear, and respectful. It sounds like, I need a little time to process my thoughts, but I care about this and will come back to talk with you. This kind of space honors both people. It invites healing, not fear. Harmful silence, on the other hand, is vague, cold, and prolonged. It offers no reassurance, no explanation, no pathway back to connection. It thrives on power imbalance, leaving one person to carry the weight of both emotions and resolution. When silence is used to punish, it becomes a manipulation tool. And manipulation, no matter how subtle, undermines trust. Over time, the relationship weakens, not because of what is said, but because of what is not said. Unspoken resentments, unacknowledged pain, unrepaired ruptures. All of it festers beneath the surface, slowly consuming the connection that once felt alive. This is why emotional intelligence is not only about expressing feelings, it is also about recognizing when one's actions or inactions are being used to control. A mature person learns to catch themselves in those moments of temptation, when they want to withdraw just to make someone else feel guilty, when they want to be silent, not to reflect, but to punish. And in that recognition, they make a different choice. They choose transparency over power, clarity over confusion, connection over punishment. In one story, an old couple was asked the secret to their 50-year marriage. The wife responded, "Why never stop talking?" It wasn't that they never argued. It wasn't that they never hurt each other, but they never let silence become a weapon. Even when angry, they spoke. Even when tired, they listened. Because they understood something profound: communication is the lifeblood of a relationship. Without it, the relationship doesn't die instantly. It slowly suffocates. To be in a relationship is to walk side by side through both light and shadow. It is to meet not only in joy but also in discomfort. Silence can be healing, but only when it comes from wisdom, not woundedness. When it arises from reflection, not revenge. Those who truly seek connection understand that their silence is powerful. They use it mindfully. They use it when needed, and they always return to speak. Because love doesn't leave someone in the dark. It offers a light, even if dim, to say, "I am here, I am struggling, but I'm not abandoning you." That light, no matter how small, makes all the difference. It's not about having the perfect words. It's about having the courage to stay in the conversation, to speak when it's hard, to listen when it's uncomfortable, and to remember that emotional maturity is not about winning. It's about understanding. When silence is used as punishment, nobody wins. Both lose. The one who uses silence loses the opportunity to grow, and the one on the receiving end loses the sense of safety needed to be open. But when silence is used with care, intention, and respect, it becomes a space for growth, not separation. Emotional discipline is not simply the restraint from lashing out. It is also the courage to speak gently when hurt. It is the maturity to say, "I don't know how to process this yet, but I want to." That is what keeps the heart open, even in moments of pain. And that is where transformation begins. There is a quiet conflict within many men that is rarely spoken about. It doesn't shout, and it doesn't always surface in obvious ways. But it's there, lingering beneath the surface of their silence, their defensiveness, their withdrawal. It's a conflict between the man they feel they are expected to be and the man their heart longs to become. Between control and connection, between pride and presence. This inner war often becomes most visible in how a man engages or refuses to engage in emotional intimacy. And for some, this conflict expresses itself in the act of ignoring, avoiding, or detaching from someone they once claimed to care for. When a man ignores a woman who loves him, many assume he is detached, cold, or uncaring. But more often than not, he is confused. Not always consciously, but internally. He's caught between the version of masculinity he was taught and the emotional reality he now faces. For decades, boys have been raised in environments, homes, schools, and cultures that associate emotional openness with weakness. They are taught, directly or indirectly, that strength means silence, that vulnerability is something to hide, and that control over feelings is more important than connection through them. So when a relationship asks more of him, not materially, but emotionally, it becomes foreign territory. When the woman he loves speaks about feelings, connection, or emotional presence, she isn't making demands. She's inviting him into intimacy. But if he has not been taught how to navigate that world, he may perceive the invitation as a threat. He doesn't have the tools, the language, or the inner permission to meet her there. And so, he pulls away, not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't know how to care in the way she needs. This is the silent tragedy of emotional disconnection. Not every man who withdraws is emotionally dead. Many are emotionally injured. Many are spiritually underdeveloped. They are men with full hearts but half-formed tools. Men who crave love but fear what it demands. And this fear expresses itself in silence, in absence, in avoidance. This inner struggle, the war with one's own masculinity, is rarely visible on the surface. From the outside, he may appear strong, collected, even admirable. He might succeed at work, provide financially, or maintain social confidence. But when it comes to emotional closeness, he falters. He shifts, he hides. He might change the subject when things get real, or walk away during arguments, or stay physically present but emotionally unreachable. These are not random actions. They are learned strategies, coping mechanisms to survive a masculinity that never allowed softness, sorrow, or sensitivity. A woman once described how the man she loved would grow cold and distant every time she tried to express affection through deeper conversation. He would freeze up, become silent, and eventually retreat. She would ask him what was wrong. He would respond with, "Nothing, I'm fine." But his eyes told a different story. His posture sagged. His energy shifted. She began to feel like her desire for closeness was a burden. Not because he said so, but because he disappeared in its presence. The pain was not just in being ignored. It was in realizing that the man she loved was emotionally unreachable. Not because he didn't want to reach back, but because he never learned how. When a man cannot meet the emotion energy of a woman, he often feels powerless. Not in the aggressive sense, but in the silent, internal kind. His partner's emotional expressiveness may overwhelm him. Her desire to talk things through, to explore meaning and feelings, to understand and be understood. These may seem excessive to him, but in truth, they only seem that way because he is underprepared. It's not that she's asking too much, it's that he has too little within himself to meet her fully. This is not a flaw in her, it is a missing link in him. And this is where emotional maturity becomes essential, not just for the health of a relationship, but for the wholeness of the man himself. Masculinity that is not rooted in emotional intelligence becomes hollow. It becomes performative. It tries to lead without listening. It seeks respect without connection. It builds walls where it should build bridges. When a man is at war with his own masculinity, he is not able to love well. He might provide, protect, or even sacrifice. But love requires more than action. It requires presence. It requires attunement. It requires the willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of feeling deeply, of letting go of control. And that requires a different kind of strength, one not taught in most childhoods, not modeled in most cultures. The truth is, many men are emotionally undernourished. They have spent years being told to suppress, to distract, to harden. So when they find themselves in relationships with women who are emotionally available, they are both drawn in and terrified. Part of them longs for the warmth and depth she offers. Another part of them fears being seen in ways they have never allowed before. This inner division becomes the silent driver behind the pattern of ignoring, ghosting, or distancing. It's not that the man is cruel. It's that he is conflicted. His heart wants closeness. His conditioning wants control. A real man, a whole man, is not one who dominates emotions. It is one who integrates them. He doesn't avoid emotional conversations. He learns how to participate in them. He doesn't dismiss a woman's emotional needs. He learns how to hold space for them. He doesn't run from intimacy. He trains himself to stay with it, even when it feels uncomfortable. A story is told of a man who grew up with a father who never once said, "I love you." Not because the father didn't love him, but because he didn't know how. As the son grew older, he promised himself he would be different. But when he fell in love, he found himself repeating the same behaviors. Every time his partner needed reassurance, he would grow quiet. Every time she cried, he felt helpless. He thought he was failing, but in truth, he was simply untrained. So he did something rare. He asked for help. He went to therapy. He read. He listened. He humbled himself, not because he was weak, but because he was ready to be whole. And slowly, he learned how to sit with feelings, how to respond instead of retreat, how to stay when his instincts told him to escape. He didn't lose his masculinity in the process. He found a version of it that could love deeply without fear. This is the path of transformation, not for the faint-hearted, but for the brave, for the man willing to question the definitions of strength he inherited, for the man ready to exchange emotional control for emotional connection. When a man ignores a woman, it may seem like detachment, but it's often a symptom of internal fragmentation. The parts of him that were taught to suppress are at odds with the parts of him that want to connect. And unless he resolves that inner tension, he will continue to sabotage the very relationships that could heal him. This is not a call for blame. It's a call for awareness. For many men, the choice to ignore isn't made in cruelty. It's made in confusion. But confusion doesn't excuse responsibility. At some point, a man must decide what kind of presence he wants to bring into someone else's life. Does he want to be remembered as someone who disappeared when emotions ran high? Or someone who showed up, even if imperfectly, and chose to stay? One doesn't need to have all the answers to love well, but one does need to be available. Ignoring is not neutral. It's not doing nothing. It sends a message. It creates emotional distance. It shapes how a woman sees herself and how safe she feels to express her truth. When a man ignores, he may protect his ego, but he wounds the bond. And sometimes those wounds don't heal, not because love was absent, but because love was left unanswered. Healing begins when a man is willing to reimagine what masculinity means, not as armor, but as presence, not as dominance, but as depth, not as emotional avoidance, but as emotional participation. And it is in that reimagining that relationships can begin to thrive. Because a man who learns how to be emotionally available is a man who doesn't just love, he nourishes, he supports, he grows. Not by changing who he is, but by becoming more of who he was always meant to be. In every relationship, especially one where love was once alive, there is a silent yearning for understanding, for repair, for presence. And yet, when one person is ignored, when one is met with prolonged absence or emotional withdrawal, a strange reversal often happens. The one being hurt begins to seek, to reach, to explain. The one doing the ignoring stands still, removed, untouched. But this dynamic, when held over time, does not just affect the one being ignored. It reshapes the man who chooses to ignore. Slowly, without noticing, he begins to lose something essential. Not just the relationship, but the strength of his own character. There's a common illusion that walking away or withdrawing from someone emotionally gives a man power. That being unmoved, unavailable, or unreachable is a form of control or confidence. But control is not strength. Detachment is not wisdom. Ignoring someone in pain, someone who has given you emotional access, is not a sign of inner mastery. It's a sign of internal collapse, because no man stays whole while leaving another in pieces. Every time a man ignores someone who loves him, he makes a decision, consciously or unconsciously, to disconnect not only from the person in front of him, but also from his own emotional responsibility. And in doing so, he chips away at something deeper, his integrity. For integrity is not about always being right or composed. It is about being aligned between one's values, words, and actions. When a man says he cares but disappears in silence, he fractures that alignment. He begins to live in contradiction, and contradiction, when practiced often, turns into character erosion. True strength lies not in the ability to walk away, but in the willingness to stay present when it is hardest. Not in disappearing when confronted with pain, but in remaining grounded, honest, and open. When a man retreats behind silence, when he uses avoidance as a solution, he may feel relief in the short term. But the cost of that relief is deep, because he loses the very qualities that make love, leadership, and presence possible: empathy, courage, and emotional clarity. There is a quiet dignity in facing someone you've hurt, not with excuses, but with humility. There is growth in listening, even when your pride wants to defend. There is healing in saying, "I was wrong," or "I didn't handle that well," or even just, "I'm here now." But none of this can happen when silence becomes the default. Silence, when used not for reflection, but for avoidance, creates separation that the heart cannot bridge on its own. A woman once shared how her partner, after a disagreement, stopped speaking to her for 2 weeks. No explanation, no warning, just complete emotional abandonment. She sent messages, called, left voicemails. At first, she was worried, then confused, then angry, and finally numb. By the time he reached back out, casually, as if nothing had happened, something in her had shifted. It wasn't just trust that was broken, it was respect. Because in those 2 weeks of silence, she saw clearly. She had been carrying the weight of emotional maturity alone, and she realized that the man who ignored her wasn't stronger than her. He was running from responsibilities she had already faced within herself. This is what silence does when it's misused. It doesn't just hurt others. It reveals the unhealed parts within the one who chooses it. From a psychological perspective, this behavior is often linked to emotional repression. Men who ignore others during emotional conflict usually have not learned how to self-regulate. Instead of working through emotion, they shut it down. Instead of expressing, they suppress. This suppression doesn't disappear. It becomes a hidden narrative, a quiet story that tells him he is unfit to deal with real connection. And over time, he begins to believe it. A man who avoids hard conversations is not preserving peace. He is preserving a version of himself that cannot grow, because growth doesn't come through escape. It comes through meeting the discomfort, leaning into it, and learning how to remain whole in its presence. Relationships are not destroyed in a single moment of silence. They are undone by the pattern of silence repeated, of presence withheld, of needs unmet. Neuroscience shows us that human connection is wired into our biology. The brain thrives on attunement, on co-regulation, on mutual presence. This is especially true in intimate relationships, where safety is not built on words alone, but on consistency of attention and care. When one partner goes silent, the other's nervous system senses it as a threat. Heart rate increases, stress hormones rise, anxiety builds, because emotional neglect activates the same pain centers in the brain as physical pain. It is not imagined. It is not exaggerated. It is real. To ignore someone is not just to remove conversation. It is to remove safety. And no love can flourish where safety is absent. A story is told of an old violinist who owned a rare and beautiful instrument. He played it daily, cleaned it, tuned it with care. But then, one day, life became busy. He left the violin untouched for months. It sat in a corner, collecting dust. When he finally picked it up again, he noticed something had changed. The strings were brittle. The wood felt dry. It didn't sound the same. And he realized neglect is not passive. It is destructive. So too with relationships. Time and silence do not heal what has been neglected. They harden it. But here lies the deeper cost for the man who ignores. He loses his capacity for emotional depth. Every time he turns away from vulnerability, he dulls the very part of himself that is capable of deep love, deep presence, and deep humanity. It is not the world that hardens him. It is his own refusal to soften. This hardening shows up in unexpected ways. He becomes irritable, detached, cynical. He may even become addicted to work, to distractions, to anything that keeps him from facing what he feels. And in this state, he begins to believe that connection is too risky, that emotion is weakness, that distance is safer than closeness. But none of these beliefs are true. They are protective lies, armor worn by a man who has forgotten that vulnerability, when handled with care, is not dangerous. It is transformative. There is an old quote: "A man is not measured by how many hearts he can touch, but by how many he can hold." To hold a heart is to be responsible with it, to protect it not by retreating, but by staying, not by controlling, but by being present. And presence requires something silence cannot offer: emotional participation. Ignoring someone may feel like avoidance, but it is actually an emotional message. It says, "I am not equipped to meet you here." And unless that message is recognized, acknowledged, and healed, the pattern will continue, relationship after relationship, silence after silence, until the man himself feels the consequences in the form of isolation, regret, and unspoken pain. Because the truth is, emotional absence leaves a trail, and the longer one ignores the trail, the harder it becomes to return. But this trail is not impossible to walk back. A man once said that the greatest regret of his life was not the words he spoke in anger, but the words he never said when he had the chance, the apology he never gave, the hand he never reached for, the silence he allowed to last too long. He said, "It wasn't the argument that broke us, it was the silence that followed." In that silence, he lost not just his relationship, but his connection to his own truth. Because every moment of emotional abandonment creates distance, not just between two people, but within the self. A man cannot feel whole while leaving others broken. He cannot find peace while avoiding responsibility. There is strength in choosing to return, not just to a conversation, but to emotional integrity. Strength in saying, I was silent when I should have spoken. Strength in saying, I avoided you when I should have stayed. These admissions are not weakness. They are acts of inner alignment. And alignment is what restores character. A man's worth is not measured by how often he wins arguments, avoids discomfort, or maintains power. It is measured by how deeply he can connect, how bravely he can admit fault, and how consistently he can choose presence over protection, because presence is not a personality trait. It is a choice, a discipline, a practice. And when that practice is abandoned, a man doesn't just lose the relationship, he loses his center. Every ignored message, every unanswered call, every moment of intentional silence leaves a mark. And the one left behind may carry that pain, but the one who ignored carries a different burden, the burden of disconnection from his own capacity to love well. To ignore is to weaken, not immediately, but gradually, deeply, until one day the silence that once felt like safety becomes a wall too high to climb. And so the question a man must ask himself is not, how do I avoid conflict? But rather, what kind of man do I want to be when love becomes uncomfortable? Because it's in those moments, not the easy ones, that character is revealed, not in charm, not in charisma, but in what one chooses when discomfort arises. Do they engage or do they disappear? The answer to that question determines not just the future of the relationship, but the future of the man himself. In the end, the measure of a man is not found in how well he hides his emotions, how skillfully he avoids difficult conversations, or how long he can remain silent in the face of conflict. It is revealed in his capacity to stay present, especially when his presence is uncomfortable, vulnerable, or uncertain. Ignoring someone is never neutral. It is a choice with consequences, not only for the one who is ignored, but for the one who chooses to ignore. Because every time a man turns away from connection, he turns away from a part of himself. He may convince himself that silence protects his peace or safeguards his dignity, but in truth, silence misused becomes the very thing that erodes what is noble within him. Love does not thrive in avoidance. Relationships do not deepen through emotional distance, and character is not built by evading responsibility, but by facing it, with humility, with courage, and with the willingness to grow. Every man will be faced with moments where retreat feels easier than engagement, but the one who rises, who chooses to stay open, to respond with care, and to honor the humanity of another, walks a path not only of emotional maturity, but of inner mastery, because the greatest strength is not found in detachment, but in presence, not in the ability to ignore, but in the willingness to connect. And the one who understands this does not just build better relationships, he builds a better self.